Now to introduce our presenter for tonight's lecture. John Mark Courtney is an avid plantsman, professional grower, and lover of all things wild. He is the founder and owner of Kind Earth Growers, LLC, a native plant nursery specializing in aquatic, wetland, and upland perennials in Upper Bucks County, Pennsylvania. After completing his bachelor's degree in environmental design at Delaware Valley University in 1998, he began to pursue his passion for native plants and environmental stewardship. His career has included positions at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve and Aquascapes Unlimited, where he was the head grower and operations manager for 20 years. John was a part of the 2014 Greenhouse Product News class of 40 under 40 and winner of the 2016 Pennsylvania Landscape and Nursery Association Green Achiever Award. We can't wait to hear from John tonight. So at this point, I will turn things over to him to get us started. Hi, John.
Hey, Amy. Thanks so much for that. I really appreciate it. It's great being here tonight with all you guys. Love Jenkins Arboretum, and it's really nice to be able to have this ability to present one of my favorite topics, the wet meadow. It's one of the habitats that I've been uniquely involved with for almost my entire growing career. Once I got out of college, and it's one I hope we have fun tonight and share. So, as Amy said, if there are questions that come up as I'm chatting, please feel free to drop your line in the chat box. And if it's pertinent to the topic in which we're covering at the time, I'm happy to take a pause and answer your questions. But without further ado, we are Kind Earth Growers. We are a fantastic crew of over 22 people this past summer, all native plant enthusiasts, all very passionate about native habitat, collecting local seed, and getting some of the best plants out and into the trade and into your homes, backyards, gardens, public spaces, and where it might be. We established in 2017 with literally myself and two fantastic volunteers, one of which is my wife, Erin, and then also my current head grower and longtime coworker, Joe Lamant. And what started with just the three of us as a side project has quickly blossomed into 6 full-time amazing employees and also 15 seasonal full-time passionate growers. So we are a fun bunch and a family style business. We grow 99% of our native plants from seed. We have a list of 200 different species that we produce here. We collect seed here in the northern Piedmont, where we sit today, in Upper Bucks, and also yourself down in Philadelphia. We venture over to the intercoastal plain in New Jersey, just across the river, Hunterdon County and Mercer County. And then we also collect some seed in the Ridge Valley, just north of us, up in Lehigh Valley and a little further north. All these areas that we go to are obviously permissioned and some private property, and then also friends that have fantastic gardens that we've helped plant over the years. And we'll get stuff from our 3-acre meadow out here at Kind Earth, or from our founders plots, where we have painstakingly planted all of the species that we have trouble collecting in the wild. We're timing out perfectly, so we have them here on site, and we keep good close eye on them and make sure we're harvesting at the right time. But this is our final product. We pride ourselves in some of the best produced landscape 50 plugs in the industry. As a small grower, we use a lot of different bio inputs and biostimulants, as well as beneficial bacterias and beneficial insects to control all of our pests in the greenhouse. And the proof is truly in the product. We love our roots, and we love when they're in the ground, right in the native soil. But more importantly, we do all this because it's all about habitat here at Kind Earth. And for us, habitat building, habitat creation, and just helping the natural world around us to continue to heal itself as from almost catastrophic levels of destruction. That's really why we do what we do here at Kind Earth. And today, as I said, we'll be talking about the lovely wet meadow habitat. It's one that I absolutely adore. One, first, because of its ability to have tremendous biodiversity, as well as ecosystem services. The biodiversity truly comes from subtle changes in topography that define where and which plants are growing. Here in this photograph, you can see things like, hibiscus on the top right of the screen, as well as Joe Pye in the forefront, but then also little Rudbeckia triloba in the background. And really what's going on here is just subtle changes in topography that are allowing for these species to coexist in what is seemingly a beautiful habitat garden. That's what's really fun about the wet meadow. The different characteristics of wet meadows, they're found, these types of habitats are naturally found in our area here in the Piedmont, either in riparian zones along small creeks and rivers. You can find them in old agricultural fields that have been left fallow. These are areas in old ag fields where there might have been heavy grazing or overcompaction from animals. So you get this poorly drained soil, typically consisting of high clay. Perhaps it's a depression kettle in the topography where water is going to sit for a good period of time throughout the season. But mostly we're talking about clay soil, seasonally wet, and it also goes through periods of drought. So all the plants that exist in these habitats have root structures and root systems that can handle, a certain level of standing water and seasonal inundation, as well as going through a period like we're seeing today with, almost 19 days without rain here in Ottsville. I'm sure it's a nail biting situation, and I'm thankful that it's the end of the growing season and not the middle of the growing season. Here's an example of a riparian wet meadow that I came across last year in Ithaca, just outside of Ithaca, New York. And this was a nice shaded, cool glade where there was an intermittent stream, very flat bottomland, where things like the sweet flag that you see in the background were growing, and woodland sunflower. This habitat is one that is very wet, very rich soil down in the bottomland, where it was kind of clay, but also like a loamy kind of clay, where it was high in organic matter, and all these plants are just thriving lovely. So this is a really nice, cool kind of wet meadow, very different than the previous photograph. And then this here is a true floodplain, an area that only comes wet when the river overspills its banks. But again, this is another riparian example of a wet meadow. The plant in all of its glory right here is the golden groundsel. It's a very low rhizomatous species that's blooming in May. Really great plant for difficult situations where you need to cover ground really fast. And then here back out into the full sun, here's a wet meadow that actually features a pond. And what's unique about this is that not all wet meadows have ponds or have open water, right? So this person in particular decided to plant the pond with our Native American lotus to kind of hide and take over that open water space, and to allow the wet meadow to begin to fill in and creep into the edges of the pond. Their goal was not necessarily to have open water, but to have more habitat and diverse flower structure in their landscape. And then at one of my favorite places, Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve, this is a bottom of their field where it is seasonally wet, and it's dominated by these beautiful grasses in the fall. In the foreground is our northern sea oats, and in the background is Indian grass, the Sorghastrum nutans. Really, really neat area. It's a very, very densely planted area that is dominated by these two species. You're lacking biodiversity, but you have high ecological function, especially in the soil, because the root systems on these two species are diving down into that soil structure and allowing for water and rain to penetrate as it falls on this site. A very manicured, if you will, manicured to some people. This would be a manicured roadside swale. This is an area that is very seasonally wet. In fact, almost wet through the middle of June. But you see things like switchgrass and mountain mints, and there's a whole host of little sedges that are weaving their way in through the ground plane, that's helping to keep this habitat intact as a nice wet meadow. And then finally, stormwater best management practices. This is at the bottom of our nursery. This is what we consider our nutrient capture pond, but it also dries up often. So it's more of a, I would say, wet retention slash detention catchment, where we're using things like sedges and irises that would be a key component in a wet meadow, but then also celebrating the water and the hydrology with things like pickerel rush and arrowhead and water plantain, all species that we obviously collect seed from on our property, but then also perform great functionality as far as cleaning up excess nutrient that may be leaching out of our plant material and filtering it before it gets to the agricultural ditch that ultimately leads to Lake Nakamixon. And our 3-acre meadow here at Kind Earth, this is a meadow that we have a very wet property, and this is truly a wet meadow in that it is an old agricultural hayfield, and previous to that was grazed by cattle. This is going back into the late or early 1900s, late 1800s. In the wintertime, you can't walk out here because the soil and the clay is such that the water table is suspended and captured in that clay. So it's an area that's very difficult to, let's say, create a traditional lawn or something like that. So what we did, and not to go too far down the rabbit hole with how we created this meadow, but what we did was we just changed management practices and shifted our mowing times with the farmer to allow for warm season expression so that we can actually create this nice warm season grass spectacle that you see here and behind me. That took this photo just a couple days ago. But what you don't see is underneath all of these, this is broom sedge, just underneath all of this broom sedge is a whole smattering of cool season sedges in the Carex genus. And they hold and weave this whole meadow together so that all of the layers and the seasons are covered with active growing roots that are penetrating the soil and allowing for water to penetrate down as far as it can go. Given our clay, it doesn't go very far, but it's one that the root structure of this meadow allows for maximum infiltration of the water, thereby slowing all of the stormwater, but maintaining this beautiful wet meadow appearance that we're really proud of. So when I talk about root structure, it's really important to take into consideration the different types of root structures that all of these different native perennials have and how they interact with one another, because that essentially is what weaves that matrix that we're going to be talking about. So I'd just like to highlight some really obvious root structures that occur in the species in the wet meadow. And the first and foremost is the fibrous shallow roots. Now, these are generally annuals or biennial species. These plants will generally occur in areas of disturbance in the meadow. So whether it's an area that maybe, you drove your tractor into by, on purpose, or whatever it might be, whatever disturbance happens, deer laying or a deer browse or what have you, these are the species that are going to come into this area and help to cover the ground. In particular, some of my favorites, the first is cardinal flower, which is a very shallow, fibrous rooted plant, and actually kind of short-lived, even though it has beautiful flowers, and we try to use it in our garden all the time. We all know that its life in the garden is generally short, and it's seeds that proliferate the population. Other plants like beggar tick, which is Biden's frondosa. It's a beautiful yellow flower. I have a couple of pictures of it soon coming up. But that is one of our native biennials that always gets caught in your fleece this time of year. When you're walking through a nice little meadow and you come out and you're covered in all these little seeds and prickers. That's the beggar tick. But the flower is by far absolutely gorgeous when it's blooming. Again, that's a biennial, so it's a very shallow root, kind of fibrous, and it's one that thrives in disturbance. And then, of course, everyone's favorite with its fibrous, shallow roots is the annual Japanese stiltgrass, one that has leapt from our woods and has made its way into some of these meadow habitats and can truly create some havoc in some of these habitats. The second type of root structure is the fibrous deep roots. Now, these are the type of roots that you get from clump forming warm season and cool season grasses. These stabilize the soil. They're fine roots, but they'll go down, 12, 16, 18 inches as far as the soil will allow them to do. And this type of plant with these deep fibrous roots and the clumps that form actually create beautiful habitat structure within the wet meadow for ground nesting birds, winter cover, but they're also allowing for these kind of bare spots in the soil for other plants to weave their way around, whether they might be stolons or rhizomes. But these deep fibrous roots are kind of the backbone to this wet meadow habitat. Thirdly is the deep tap roots. Of course, these are the long-lived flowering perennials. These are things like your ironweeds and your milkweeds and your goldenrods. These are your flowers, right? This is your flower power. Hairy beard tongue or Penstemon digitalis. These plants will have deep tap roots, or their roots are very coarse in that they're much thicker, and they kind of go down and they work their way into the fibrous root system of the grasses that are next to them, and then they'll thrive amongst that mat that's occurring in the soil. And then finally is can be some of our bullies, but also some of our hardest working plants is the rhizominous species. And these are plants like Canadian blue joint grass or Calamagrostis canadensis, water sedge, and some of the goldenrods that can really take over and form like these big colonies. Generally, rhizominous species, if I'm going to introduce them into a landscape, the landscape needs to be able to accept them. So we're talking about larger scale style plantings, quarter to half to 1 acre large and larger, in order to be able to handle the onslaught of this rhizominous colony forming plant. Of course, one of the worst ones is the non-native cool season reed canary grass, or Phalaris arundinaceae. This is a plant that can be common and is seen often throughout Bucks County and in the Philadelphia area. It comes up, blue-green in the spring. It's one of the first things up, and its rhizome is almost a quarter inch to, a little bit thicker in size and diameter, and it can really run and take over an area, and difficult to control. So it's one that I would love for all of you guys to identify. But those are the different root structures, right, that characterize the wet meadow species. And I always start with the roots because it's truly the foundation of plant interaction and how these plants are going to eventually coexist within the habitat. We often think of plants just above the ground, their flower, their height, their width, spread, etc. And that's all well and good, but what are the roots doing, and how are the roots allowing them to, share space with their neighbor? Because at the end of the day, it's all about plants that play well together and share space in order to weave a habitat that, number one, is legible, but then also is pleasing to the eye and functioning ecologically. And a great example of that is this photograph here, where we have things like hibiscus. This is a different angle of the photo I showed earlier, but you can really see these plants kind of weaving in together. One I'd like to highlight in particular is that Rudbeckia, the black-eyed Susan that you see in the background. That's Rudbeckia triloba, and that typically is a biennial. And this is a very young planting, in such that the Rudbeckia is still in a dominant phase, right? It's still taking up a lot of bare soil. It has the ability to take up that space, but as things like the hibiscus and the joe pye and the monardas that are in this composition begin to, kind of spread out and flex their muscle a little bit, that Rudbeckia is only going to find itself in these little pockets of disturbance and bare soil, and ultimately, in time will become more of a stable and long-term style meadow. One of the shallow root perennials I'd love to highlight, that work fantastic in these full sun areas. I know I talked about the golden groundsel, or Packer aurea, in a shady riparian zone. This one in particular is one that occurs in our meadow and is very common here in Upper Bucks County. This is also Packer aurea, but its habitat is full sun and wet meadow, and it keys itself down. If you took a dichotomous key and keyed this one out, it, from the naked eye, looks very different. It's just smaller in size and stature. and actually more well-behaved in growth pattern. But it keys out to the smallest number in the dichotomous key, and the one in the shade riparian keys out to the largest number in the dichotomous key. So no one has split this one up. The taxonomists haven't gotten their hands on it yet, but this is Pachyra aurea in the full sun. It's our local native genotype of Pachyra here in our area. And it's one that, like I said, blooms in the spring, and you find it coming up in areas amongst the sedges and amongst the dormant warm season grasses, and it just really performs well. It has that shallow root, and it finds its way around all these little pockets, and it just covers the ground, right? The idea of no bare soil, like fill it with plants, fill it with greenery. I apologize for the out of focus picture here on the left, but there it is. There's ironweed, right? There's one of our long-lived perennials of the wet meadow. One that has really thick roots and will dive down almost 24 to 30 inches into the soil if allowed. And then in the foreground is some Lobelia cardinalis, our cardinal flower. Again, a short-lived species, but it was an area this is in our meadow. This is an area that I actually did drive my tractor across the edge of the corner here to go out to my burn pile. And I created the disturbance. I created the pocket for this Lobelia to exist by accident. And once the soil conditions opened up and the sunlight was right, the lobelia was in the seed bank and it expressed itself in this lovely little pocket. It won't be there in a couple years, but that's okay. I know that its progeny will eventually pop up again if I decide to drive my tractor over that corner. But then on the right, you can see our New England aster, which is actually a wetland species. It's an obligate species. It's found very often in wet meadows, but you see it here with things like big blue stem and some little blue stem, and then also, some of the sedges that have gone dormant in that understory, because this picture is, obviously it's late September, early October. But again, it's the composition, it's the weaving, it's the fabric that we're looking at, and how these plants all interact with each other. An example of rhizomatous species on the left-hand side, it's mildly aggressive, but it's actually quite nice in a meadow situation. It's aggressive in a garden, but in a meadow situation, one that can be used in a smaller meadow, is the blue mist flower. And here you see it kind of weaving its way through the bunch grasses. So as I said, those bunch grasses are solitary, clumps, and they leave all of their foliage in the wintertime will eventually, smother things that are around it. But things like the blue mist flower can weave its way through that little area and then express itself in the late season and really kind of give you a nice dynamic of color and structure as well. And then on the right, to highlight plants that are from last year, what's really interesting. So the purple milkweed that's in the foreground, you can see my little pink flag there too, because I was marking this population. The purple milkweed is blooming and fragrant like honey. It's absolute sweet honey plant. With last year's broom sedge grass flower, right? So this is an area that I didn't mow. I allowed the old foliage to stand throughout the 2 seasons, and you can see senescence of last year's, brown grass, and you have this lovely backdrop for the purple milkweed, which is a rhizomatous species as well, to allow it to weave its way around through this section of the meadow. Really fantastic. But then diving into the more fun species that I personally love the most is diving into all of our sedges. They're some of the best species and some of the best compositions in any wet meadow. On the left and on the right, both, you're seeing things like tussock sedge and fox sedge and blunt broom sedge. You can see irises kind of popping up their way through there, and lovely, very vertical soft rush Juncus effusus. These species truly are the backbone of all wet meadows, and you don't really have a wet meadow habitat without a sedge. Some of the grasses, so that was our cool season, like back to that. So all of our sedges are cool season, and you're going to hear this theme as I continue: cool season, warm season, and the importance of identifying both and having both in your habitat. But one of the lovely warm season grass is our little blue stem, or Schizocarum scoparium, and in very different situations here, right? The picture on the right is just out here at Kind Earth in our meadow. We have nice little populations of it that have popped up naturally. And on the left is in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where this is a pocket in a granite bald that obviously catches water and doesn't let it release. So it's existing in this kind of wet pocket, but of course it dries out up there because it only fills when it rains. But the reason I'm showing you that is because it's important to understand how those two are existing, right? Like, and what the importance of ecoregion means, and does it actually matter in when you're sourcing plants for your garden or restoration or stormwater management project or what have you. And I'm just going to read this to you guys, and you can read along with me. But what is an ecoregion? It's I'm going to skip down. It's phenomena that include geology, landforms, soils, vegetation, climate, land use, wildlife, and hydrology, right? And then analyzing that and understanding the patterns and the compositions of the habitat that define an ecoregion. The EPA did this years ago. It was in 1987. They started defining ecoregions, and they broke it into 4 different levels. And this is not the end all be all of what's native and not native, but it's a great stepping stone to understand how plants are going to interact within a habitat. Personally, we look at level 3, and I said it earlier in the presentation that our seeds are from the northern Piedmont or the intercoastal plain or the ridge and valley, right? That's a level 3 terminology that I was using. When you go into level 4, it gets really detailed. But if you hear on this in this slide, this is the level 3. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can identify yourself on the map, and you can highlight what the northern Piedmont is, and then the coastal plain, right? And then just beyond that, and dark green is the ridge and valley. But if you look at the lower left corner, that's level 2. Now that is really broad, because if you look, New Hampshire and Western Maine and Pennsylvania are all in the same ecoregion. But clearly, in the photo that I showed you earlier, those two little blue stems are much different from each other, right? And here I pulled up the native range of little blue stem, and the bright green dots are all the counties in which it natively exists. So what I'm trying to say, and what I'd like you guys to take away from this, is that regionality does matter, and where the seeds are sourced does matter, and if it in fact will perform in the habitat in which you're putting it. Okay. There are some lovely cultivars of little blue stem. They're fantastic. I have them in my garden. They love dry soil. You find them along some populations I found along like railroad tracks where it's super dry and rocky and coarse. And then there's others locally that occur in these like heavy wet clay soils. And I'm collecting the seed from the heavy wet clay soil for the heavy wet meadow, as opposed to taken from the railroad tracks and trying to force that into a wet meadow situation. So at the end of all this idea of ecoregions, it does matter, right? And regionality and genotype do matter, specifically when you're talking about survivability in the landscape. So that's kind of my little spiel on ecoregions and why we do what we do, and how we do it, and the reason being. So let's get back on track and talk about warm season and cool season, and what does it mean to me. I'm looking at warm season, cool season grasses and sedges in the matrix, and the importance of both, and why it's important to have both, and the functionality of the two. So warm season grasses, as the name implies, are plants that are growing generally, mid to late May through September. They're adapted to survive that drought and the heat of July and August. That's when they actually send up their flower spikes or their inflorescence. They have very deep, extensive root systems, good nutrient uptake when the roots are active, and that also provides soil stabilization. As I was saying, with winter persistence of their stiff upright inflorescence, you're providing great structure for nesting birds, and good habitat structure for insects and things of that nature. These are examples would be switchgrass or panicum. all the blue stems. The one behind me in the photograph is broom sedge, which is a blue stem, or Andropogon virginicus, or the one we just chatted about was Schizocarum scripoides, the little blue stem, and of course big blue stem and Indian grass and things like that. But the often overlooked species in a native species in this meadow matrix is in fact the cool season sedges and grasses. Now, all the sedges in Pennsylvania are cool season. Okay. There are a fair amount of cool season grasses that have great attributes, but by and large, most of the cool season grasses that we are all familiar with are things like our turf grasses or orchard grass, Johnson grass, etc. Those are all leftover forage crops from Europe. So some of our, the characteristics of the cool season grass obviously is that it's actively growing and specifically rooting when the soil temperature is in that 40 to 45 degrees. So, think March, April, mid-May, and then again in times like now, like all of our sedges began to kind of reflush a little bit. They'd started about early to mid-September because it was a little cooler this year, and that'll go on through late October. These plants are adapted to cooler, wetter conditions. I mean, we should be wet right now, but we're not. But again, because their roots are active in this cool time when the warm seasons are not, we're getting continued nutrient uptake. We're getting continued soil stabilization, but more importantly, we're extending the season of rooting, which is allowing for rain to absorb into the soil. Okay, that's really important to take home. So examples of these again would be a Columbograsus or Canadian blue joint grass, foul manna grass, and of course all the sedges. And we are going to talk about sedges soon. So here's an example here of a lot of some cool season grasses that are mixed with a nice warm season mix here. You can see things like blunt broom sedge at the bottom of the screen. You can see juncus, tufted hairgrass, all kind of in this early season, greenery, this initial green up in the landscape. And later in the season, you'll get your flowers and your warm season grasses popping up. But back to sedges, because I told you we're going to talk a lot about sedges. So what are the benefits of them, right? So they can be viewed as a ground cover, and indeed that's largely what they are. They're characterized with deep fibrous root systems that stabilize and build soil. They build soil in a really unique way. About 50 to 60% of their root systems, sometimes more, will not die, but slough off in the wintertime when they go dormant. So if you look at a sedge, imagine pulling it out of the ground, washing it off with a hose, and look at its root system and think to yourself, at almost half of these roots are going to die in the soil, but the plant's going to stay alive. What that effectively is doing is, as it's rooting, it's driving carbon down into the soil. It's opening up all those capillaries into the soil and allowing for water movement, air movement, oxygen in the form of oxygen, as well as creating micro paths in the soil to help build it and create better soil health, right? So they're performing all of these functions underneath your feet. And what you get on top is just this grassy little tuft that is absolutely adorable, but that's me. But again, deep fibrous roots, they allow the water and nutrients to infiltrate the soil. They're all pretty much deer resistant unless the deer has absolutely nothing left to eat. Because they take up this ground plane and they form this dynamic ground plane, you're getting weed competition and you're covering ground. It can be used as a lawn alternative with other plants, to create a lawn alternative. And more importantly, there's a sedge for every situation, is what I like to say. Dry shade, wet sun, you name it. There's sedges everywhere. I think there's over 800 species in Pennsylvania alone. So examples of that, some of my favorite examples of that, I didn't go too deep into showing you a bunch of grass pictures or sedge pictures, this is our tussock sedge, really lovely, ornamental. It kind of has this nice wavy characteristic to it. These can grow almost 2.5 to 3 feet tall and can be a major visual component of a wet meadow in an area that you want to have maybe a very intentional drift and patch of other fun, cute ones, because the beauty of the sedge is truly in the head. The sedge heads. This is the Carrick's Grayi or Gray's sedge, and you can see it with its mace-like awns that you see here in this photograph. But this one has a beautiful broadleaf to it too. It's not as, it's not as graceful and arching as the tussock sedge that I showed you earlier. But this is what can be accomplished with a nice balance of sedges and herbaceous perennials, flowering perennials. Generally, a general rule of thumb that I like to go with is that you should have at least 60 to 70% grass and sedge cover in a wet meadow or any meadow, with 40 to 30% flowering forbs to pepper in throughout, right? Because the flowering forbs are fantastic, but it's the dynamic ground plane and the root structure that's all helping to create that habitat and hold it together in kind of a strong fabric, right? And again, here's beautiful, bone sets and milkweeds and some well-behaved goldenrods and ironweed, but the whole ground plane is held together with these sedges. So I can't stress anymore how important that combination of sedges and grasses, cool and warm season, is to the survivability of a true habitat. Okay. And of course, everything has beauty in senescence. If you don't find beauty in brown, we live in the wrong state. There's textures and catching it on a frosty morning soon come. It's a lovely, peaceful kind of situation. A little bit more of what I was showing you earlier. So on the left is big blue stem, a very dominant species, one that I don't use lightly. It's one that can come in like Indian grass or Gastrum natans, can come in and truly find every little nook and cranny to germinate in. And you can go from a nice 3 to 4 foot high manageable meadow with a nice path to an alarming 6 to 7 foot high meadow that you will find snakes and all kinds of fun things in. I'm just kidding. You won't find any of that stuff, but you might find a snake. But it just becomes a little bit more oppressive in when things get taller. People are afraid of tall plants. But big blue stem on the left, Andropogon gerardii, fantastic plant if you have the space for it. But one that I would include in a very low percentage in any habitat until it becomes established. And then on the right, again, apologize for this blurry picture. I was trying to highlight the dormant little blue stem in the background, with the foreground being the milkweed. But again, the dormant grass in the background was from the season prior. So having last year's foliage and this year's foliage still emerging, you get that dichotomy and that opposite positive negative kind of effect that I always love. It just adds a nice element to the landscape. And again, just to celebrate the beauty of senescence, because that's the season that we find ourselves in. The plant on the right is our native rough leaf goldenrod, or Solidago rugosa. There's a fantastic cultivar that's being trialed right now down at Mount Cuba called Fireworks. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. It's one that has been in the trade for a long time. But this is one of the natural forms that I have found in our own meadow. And it kind of has that Fireworks look to it, but just a little bit tighter. And on the left, obviously in seed with the milkweed in the background and the broom sedge. So again, just celebrating the 4 seasons, and really, really diving into what beauty means, because a lot of these habitats, these wet meadow habitats, when we go to create them on our own properties, whether it be, here in Upper Bucks, where it's a little bit more rural, or in Doylestown or Jenkintown or Glenside, wherever you might find yourself, there are things that you have to do to create cues to care, to have it be legible to the onlooker, right? Not just to yourself. So finding the beauty in these senescence pictures is where I'm going with. Now, I mentioned goldenrod. The one in the prior photograph is not one that is heavily rhizominous. It tends to be behaved and can exist in a garden with very little maintenance. But of course, goldenrods can be pretty aggressive. So, in choosing the right goldenrod, they have tons of, it's one of the keystone species. It's one that should be in every garden, but the right one should be in each garden, depending on the scale and the size and location. This is obviously is Canadian goldenrod, completely dominating 3 acres. So you have to be really, really careful which one you choose. But its ecological value is still in the such that it's fantastic pollen and nectar for all of our flying insects, butterflies included, bees, wasps, solitary flies, and all the good things. So one I mentioned earlier that can also dominate is this beggar tick. So here it is, the beggar tick in full bloom. And as you're cursing all the little beggar ticks you're pulling out of your fleece, just remember that this is what it looked like for 3 weeks in August when it was in full bloom. You can only imagine the goldfinch party that happens in meadows like this. But this is a wet meadow of disturbance. Okay, this is one that was maybe a farm field that has left to go fallow, dominated by cool season non-native species. And as those species go summer dormant, the beggar tick finds those little pockets and it expresses itself, but very shallow rooted plant. So in all this conversation, the one thing that I would love to drive home, and I hope I am continuing to drive home, is the benefits of all plants in community. All right. Gardeners in general, as a general public, tend to place a lot of emphasis on the plant they bought, my milkweed plant. And that's fantastic, right? It's fantastic because it's like it gets people excited about, oh, why did you plant milkweed? Well, I did it because of this, right? So immediately that one plant is a part of a broader community, right? It's part of the monarch story. But the idea of plants in community, whether it be below ground in their root structure or above ground in their floristic diversity, is what creates a true ecological community that's going to function. And this is true in wet meadow, dry meadow, woods, what have you. It's across the board. So we're here discussing this topic to maximize biodiversity as best that we can with less emphasis on the individual plant. When we do that, we're extending our bloom period. We could get blooms in as early as March, April, May, and we could extend that all the way into November. I still have aromatic aster blooming out in the meadow right now, just looking absolutely gorgeous. And it's covered with, the last little bit of food for the bumblebees and syrphid flies and what have you. And again, it's that floristic diversity that attracts all the pollinators in and does the best and provides the best health for our broader planet. More roots in the ground equals better soil health and water infiltration. And it also brings floristic diversity, no matter where you are, brings pleasure to the garden. And it's what we are. We're gardeners, and I love it. Gardeners of the wild, gardeners of your, 10 by 10 pollinator garden, whatever it is. Like, we are gardeners, and it should bring pleasure to us and to any onlooker that happens to pass by. So how do we go about doing this? And all the pictures I've shown you are broad, kind of larger projects. And I do apologize, and I didn't dial it down to a smaller size, but all of these principles carry true no matter what the size, right? And it's the principle of designing through the process of site analysis, basic design. And I love talking about basic design because I've been a grower for 26 years, and there's a lot of creativity in it, but I love to design. I am a gardener and I'm a designer in my heart. And I do that. I only get to do that at my home, and only because I'm not for hire as a designer. But you guys are all, this is fun. So here it is. What does it mean to design through the process of site analysis? It means look at where you're at, right? Look at what you have, define what your goals are, and take your time. Any process takes time, and you can't go from 0 to hero overnight. You have to take your time, identify your site, obviously observe your sun exposure, full sun, part sun, shade, whatever it might be, identify the existing vegetation, both woody and herbaceous. And this takes the course of a season, right? Look at the existing topography, identify where how the water's flowing. Is there a depression? Does it stand for a certain period of time? How long does it stand for? And then do you plan on working with the topography and maybe creating bigger pockets, to have a little bit more water so you can have some of those plants like hibiscus, or maybe even enough water to survive a pickerel rush. But just gain, and then, after all that, looking at it, just gain a general understanding of soil composition. You can get all that information online through the different GIS sites in Bucks County. I'm sure Montgomery County has the same thing, but you can identify your property and find out what kind of soil is there. And then there's a whole list of characteristics that, tell you what kind of soil it is. And you can identify whether you have a wetland, or not a wetland, but a wet area enough to sustain a wet meadow habitat. Maybe you're shifting to a dry meadow habitat, and all the principles still are important. And then again, going back to the ecoregion, just identify your ecoregion, right? You can do it level 3 or 4, depending on what your project is or what your goals are, but just identify that. And then the last thing you need to do is to understand how the herbivores are moving through your property. Hopefully, maybe some of you have fences, maybe you don't have a lot of deer pressure, but I would be, if you don't have deer pressure, consider yourself a very lucky person. Go ahead and get a Powerball ticket tonight, because you might just hit. No, truly, just understand what's moving and how they're moving through your property so that you can plant accordingly, and maybe identify areas that you can deter so that you shift them in a different pattern, because that's what deer pressure is all about, is shifting their pattern as best you can if you can't fence. How do you get to this point now, right? So we've done our site analysis. We've taken a full year and to look at our properties. We're identifying our area. We know what we want to do. We've got a complete understanding of what's happening. Seeding and plugging is best practice, and one or the other, or in conjunction, is best practice. But what the first thing you need to do is prep that site, right? I can't emphasize anymore what site prep means, and it means the difference between success and failure. And now there's many ways of going about it, and a lot of these different techniques will depend on your appetite for, using things like vinegar, or for mowing very heavily, or for sheet mulching, or for using an herbicide. Whatever your appetite is for site preparation, the idea is to make sure your site is free of the nastiest of weeds possible, and you're giving your site the best foot forward. If you plan on seeding an area and you've got it down to your soil, it's the weeds that are going to come up, you have it ready to go. The timing is critical for the best germination. Winter seeding is fine. You're giving yourself a natural kind of stratification. And I don't want to throw that word out there without everyone understanding. Stratification is the process in which a seed will go through in order to break down its seed coat to allow it to germinate. All of our native plants have different levels of stratification requirements. In general, 30 to 60 days of cold moist is what's required for a plant to germinate when you sow it at a temperature of 70 degrees. Okay, that's seeding 101. So if you plan on seeding and you're going to go out there and seed in March, and you think that your black-eyed Susans or whatever is going to germinate in 10 to 30 days, whatever it might be, chances are they're going to get eaten by birds. So when you go to seed, make sure you have the optimal seed, right? So you can either cold moist your entire seed mix ahead of time, maybe mix it up in a trash can and put a little bit of moisture in there, and mix a little bit of moist sand, leave it outside in February. You're going to get, by the time you go to seed in April or beginning of May, you're going to get natural stratification, and the birds aren't going to get to it. If you're going to seed in the middle of summer, make sure you're seeding warm season species that actually don't need a lot of stratification, and you're going to get instant germination with the proper amount of irrigation. So timing for seeding is really critical. What I like to do personally, because let me finish the seeding, because the best thing to do with any kind of seeded meadow or project, and I'm no expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, but using a nurse crop of some kind of cereal grain, or something that's going to outcompete the weed pressure while allowing your desired species to germinate, and not outcompete them is really important. But then the other important that's really important is to keeping that area mowed to at least 6 to 8 inches for at least the first year, if not two. What that's doing is allowing those freshly germinated seedlings, it's allowing them time to establish roots. And it's also keeping any other weed seed pressure out of there. So it's a little bit involved. What I like to do personally, and some of the best projects that I've been involved with through some of my customers, is to what we call plug and play, then seed. So you identify your area, you prep your site, and you're going to plant plugs at a density of 8 to 16 inches on center. And what that's going to do is you're going to put roots in the ground that have good soil to root ratio. If you plant at the right time, you get quick establishment. And right after planting, you can go ahead and seed on top of that with some of the more, I would do some of the more showier species that are going to come up and flower in that first year. Things like your rudbeckias, or, maybe some of your native biennials that come up and give you flower power in that first year as those plugs are establishing themselves. So there's tricks and tricks and strategies to both of these, and it's very in depth. And I'm certainly not in authority I say there are much higher authorities out there on how to successfully do this. But these are some of the general tips and tricks to having success. The benefit of that plug and play idea, for one, plugs, you're going to save a ton of labor, whether you're doing this for yourself. If you're going to save labor and time if you're doing it for yourself. If you're doing it commercially, you're going to save labor and time, which is fantastic. There's tons of cost savings with plugs because you're walking out into an area, if you have used both of your hands, you're walking out there with 100 plants. That's 100 square feet, right? It's fantastic. Like you can't go walk, if you have to walk 20 feet with 4 gallons in your hands, or if you're strong-handed, you can carry 8. You got to walk back and forth a ton of times to get to 100 square feet. So the economical benefits of using plugs outweighs a ton. But the most important part of the benefits of plugs is what I'd said earlier about the optimal root density for quicker establishment in native soil. That plug, if you remember back to the slide that I used at the beginning of the plants that we produce, it's actually in the background of this one. There's nowhere for those roots to go other than into the native soil. So you're not only digging or drilling a smaller hole, so you have less impact in the soil, you're also not creating a bigger disturbance to expose more weed seeds out of that soil. You're putting that root into that ground, and it has nowhere to go but out. Right? There's no nice little pocket of peat moss to hang out in. So it's just a much quicker establishment, much quicker rooting. And it's all about timing the plugs, much like it is with seed. It's about timing your installation for the best success. The other thing that's fun about plugs is that if you have gaps in your habitat or in your area, you can fill in those gaps really easy by just popping in a couple plugs here and there just to fill in the area. So for a large green infrastructure project, it's the most economical option. And then for smaller projects, it's also an economic option because you can cover a ton of ground with 50 plants. And there's what I was talking about with the root densities. To be successful with plugs in any of these projects, wet meadow, dry meadow, woodland, what have you, it's about identifying your planting windows. And March to May, and then again, August to early October are the 2 best planting windows for any species, cool season or warm season, for things to really take off. Personally, I love that like April timeframe because you can mix your cool and warm. They're both going to be active. They're both going to take off and grow. Or you can take that mid-September timeframe and do your cool and warm season as well. It's the mid-September timeframe is a magical time of year where plants are going to put on a ton of root. They're not going to put on a ton of top growth. They generally need less water if we're not in a drought. And it's a really good time of year to plant. Always water thoroughly upon planting and allow it to dry down. I water personally at home. And here I water and I walk away. I don't look back, but that's me. It actually works. I was just looking at my time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. But if, in a large scale plug planting, here's kind of what we're looking at, right? The picture on the right was this was the shoreline planting that we then extended up into a wet meadow. Um, it was one that we planted at 12-inch centers and then seeded over top. And then on the left, here's something that was planted on 16-inch centers. This is tufted hair grass and in a really tough site, but then also was seeded. So we have our bunch grass, and then it was seeded with our flowering forbs. And again on the left, there was that shoreline planting, and I went back a couple weeks later with Jackson, my main man, and just to have a look at what was going on. You can begin to see a little bit even beyond him. He's looking out into where the meadow is, but you can see those plugs have really started to set root, take ground, and take off. So 3 to 4 weeks after implementation, you really start to get some good establishment. The picture prior, this was a 5 weeks from plug to actual growing. This is our Canadian blue joint grass, the Calamagrostis canadensis. Fantastic, cool season species. Our office manager here, Sophia Camacho, if you guys have ever called us, this is actually her site. And when I started working with Sophia about 8 years ago, when we were working together at Aquascapes, and they had just bought this property up in Tinicum, and there was a ton of lawn, and they were bitten by the Doug Tallamy bug, and also by the Pete Rudolph, the great designer of the High Line over in New York. And they wanted to recreate this intentional meadow, and they've been working on this now for about 7 years. So this is just her and her partner Hillary. The two of them painstakingly will go out, and kill areas of lawn, transplant in. They've gotten on board with the different mowing regimes that we've been talking about, as far as mowing in the late winter to encourage the sedge growth. But then also they've done some burning in April, which actually suppresses some of the non-native cool season grasses to express that warm season. It's one that is really come together very nicely. And you can see here now, this is the first picture. This is probably about 5 years in between, but you can really start to see some of these beautiful warm season grasses like the panicums and the tufted hair grass. And then that's a tufted hair grass at the bottom right, and a whole matrix of sedges throughout here. They have yet to really introduce too many forbs or flowering perennials into this, because they wanted to get that grass and sedge layer truly established, so they can then do intentional pockets of flowers. Here's another shot from their property where you see some irises. This is obviously early in the season, so the irises are blooming end of May, beginning of June, and you can see the juncus and the different Canadian blue joint grass and all the sedges down at the lower area, really holding that ground in that early season green up. And here it is a little bit later in June, when the hairy beer tongue and the purple milkweeds are all starting to come into flower, and really starting to give you that flower power that everyone expects in the June, July midsummer session. And again, beauty and senescence. I can't say enough about it. But what about maintenance, right? I've talked about this is about establishing the site, and we can all burn, right? Probably not. I had the fortunate opportunity to do a fire this year. This is from our fire that we did in April 21st this spring. I had approached my local fire company about doing a wildlands training, and they had just the right person to come in, who volunteered in Springtown. He actually has a private company that does a lot of wildland fires out west. And that day we had 3 tankers, 4 engines, 18 guys in the field, drip torches, hoses, you name it. It was fun. 3 acres went up in about 30 minutes. And that's about all it took. But what is other types of maintenance that we need to consider in these areas? And I don't like to call it maintenance. Truthfully, it's stewardship, right? Because we are stewarding this land, these gardens, this landscape to be better. And maintenance, you're just maintaining. Stewarding has dynamic connotations in its definition. So the first and foremost, in any kind of meadow, wet meadow habitat, you want to monitor for your invasive woody encroachment. These are things like your multiflora rose, or your Bradford Callery pears, or barberries and raspberries. The birds are going to leave them for you, right? You're attracting the birds, so they're going to come in and they're going to gift you all these invasive woody shrubs. For what reason, I don't know, but that's what they do. So in the earliest time, if you can catch them early, physical removal by hand when these woody shrubs are young is the best practice. It's the best practice only because it gets you out into the meadow, it gets you out into your habitat, and you're intimately engaged with it. If you let these things go a little bit longer, I mean, there's cutting and dabbing and other herbicide applications that could be done, but the early stages, the first year, um, every year, removal by hand is the easiest. Um, any undesirable species that you find, whether it be even a cattail, which I love cattails, but they have their time and place. Just don't let them go to seed, right? So don't let your undesirable species go to seed. It's just common. It's just all this is all just gardening 101 common sense kind of stuff, just on a larger scale. The use of targeted herbicide applications, both pre and post emergence, if needed, and only by a licensed professional, and one that is going to not allow for collateral damage, right? So there are companies out there that specialize in this, in meadow management through very targeted, very select herbicide applications, and they're not all bad, right? If they're helping you achieve your goal and it's only going to take one or two apps, then it's a tool in toolbox, and I think it should be viewed in that way. But that's okay. If not, it's no problem. Annual mowing, like I was talking about earlier, ideally an annual mowing of a wet meadow needs to happen when the ground's frozen, or when it's dry enough to get the tractor in, or your hand mower, whatever it might be, depending on how big your area is and how wet it is. On a small scale, personally at my home, I live in the woods, so my meadow is only 10 by 20. And I use a hedge trimmers on a pole, so it's a stand-up hedge trimmer, and I can go in and cut all that stuff back in the mid to late spring, and I can mulch it over with my mulching mower, and then throw all that back over top to help suppress the weeds wherever I have bare soil. But more importantly, with any of these, you have to establish a cue to care, and a cue to care are very simple actions that you can take around any of these more unkempt, wild kind of gardens that you may be wanting to create. And that might simply be just a very clean edge, nicely mowed around it. Perhaps it's a nice mowed trail through it. Perhaps it's a split rail fence, or whatever the aesthetic might be, but make it so that whoever's on looking is going to look at it and say, oh, no, that's intentional. They just didn't stop mowing, right? Because that's truly how we begin to change the paradigm of what is aesthetically acceptable in our suburban and urban areas. I do it even here in a more rural situation. I mow the edge, and it's kept very clean and tidy. I also burn the heck out of it, which was really fun. But on the left, just so you can see what was left after the burn is were my green paths. I mowed them prior to, and we wet them down so they wouldn't burn to a char. And it was very interesting, some of the comments I got from the folks that drove past here, in that it was obviously intentional. Some folks looked at it as a work of art because there's multiple trails through this. I wish I had a drone at the time, but next time. But that it was really, really neat. But interestingly enough, and this is my last side tangent, is that we had such a huge vole population in this meadow, which is fine. They're native, right? But meadow voles are native to the Northeast. We have a greenhouse cat that terrorizes them. It only eats voles, which is fantastic. And but the tunneling that they had actually created in this meadow was extensive, so much so that the holes were 1 to 2.5 inches wide, and down and around and everywhere you walked. And what I quickly realized was they're actually aerating the soil, but they're also creating all of these pathways and creating a sponge for water, right, to be absorbed back into either into the groundwater or just be held in the soil alone. So they're ecologically function in a major way. As much as I hate them when they eat my crops, they're doing they're performing a major ecological function in this habitat. So, and brings snakes in, which is great. But at the end of the day, everybody, I appreciate the time that you've spent with me here tonight. I hope you've gotten, I hope there's a ton of questions here that I can get to at the end of it. But, we do it for the reason we do everything we do at Kind Earth is for the broader good, and it's for the insects and the pollinators and the birds that all rely on these habitats to survive. And it's the least we can do as a company, and it's the least I can do as a human. So I hope this, if nothing else, has inspired you to create any kind of garden in a wet area that you can't mow anymore, or that you hate mowing, or you get your tires stuck in when the landscaper comes through and mows. Let's all look at those areas as missed opportunities, and just by using some of these simple tools that I've given you tonight, and some of these ideas of weaving the fabric and the matrix in the ground through the roots, and then also through floristic diversity, and helping to create these little pockets, because every little pocket matters. It could be 5 by 5, or 10 by 10, and eventually someday maybe it's 30 by 30, and then you got 3 acres all of a sudden. I don't know what it is, but yes, doing it with a cue to care and inspiring your neighbors to do the same is how we're going to ward off the impending apocalypse of insects, birds, and ultimately the Anthropocene. So with that, I leave you with this quote from Aldo Leopold, and I am welcome to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was wonderful.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. All right. So we do have I know one question came in through the chat, and we'll start there.
Mhm.
Can you suggest specific sedges that thrive in dry shade?
Yep, absolutely. Everyone's favorite, the Carex pennsylvanica, or Pennsylvania sedge. That is a slow rhizomatous species that will form a colony under oak trees, hickories, shallow soil. Really, really good one. There's also the Appalachian sedge, Carex appalachica. That's a clump forming sedge that has very fine foliage and kind of just like gracefully arches, and only gets up to about 6 to 8 inches tall. One that's a little bit tidier is our rosy sedge, Carex rosea. That also does very well in a dry shade. And then finally, Carex albicans, I think it's called the white bristle sedge. But again, very fine textured. All those kind of they're all in the same grouping of sedges as far as seed heads go, and they perform really well in dry shade. Mhm.
Awesome. You were ready for that question. Wonderful. A couple accolades have come through that this was a wonderful presentation. So thank you very much. We'll let anyone else who's with us, if you have another question for John, feel free to put it in the Q&A or the chat. I can find it in both. One thing that I was hoping that you would just touch on at the end, John, is, correct me if I'm wrong, but Kind Earth Growers is wholesale. Is that correct?
I'm sorry. Yeah, we are
Yep.
a wholesale nursery.
Okay.
Do open up the doors in when we first started, we started as retail slash, well, it was truly all retail. We were offering, plugs, quarts, and gallons for retail sales on the weekends only. And then I quickly realized that my wife and I needed time together, so we and not working, so we kind of closed the doors to full retail. But the first weekend of Pollinator Week, which is by the Xerces Society, that's the third weekend in June every year. We open up our doors for a full weekend of retail sales. We put a ton of stuff out at super discounted prices. We have like $1 plug rack. We've got, some really nice plants and stuff. So if you're interested in knowing the goings on, with different events that we might host, because we do other events as well, depending on our time, seed workshops and we've done meadow workshops and things like that. They're all on our website on the events page, or they're also on our social media too.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
Do you have any other suggestions for folks who need access to more retail operations for getting plugs?
Yeah, so I know that I know that there's a couple nurseries around here that do buy our plugs and will sell them retail.
Okay.
In Bucks County, there's Gino's Nursery down in Wrightstown. There is Good Host Plants in the Philadelphia area. I believe He's operating out of Mount Airy. It's kind of a backyard situation. Um, uh, Great, fantastic. He'll buy our plugs and pot them into quartz, but he also does sell plugs. Of course, there's Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. If you're up in this area, they have a great nursery there and a great selection of plant material. Um, there's not a lot of retail folks producing plugs, so they're going to be, either purchasing them from us or a place like North Creek or New Moon, other plug suppliers. But you can find them online through Izell Native Plants,
Yeah.
and they get shipped right to your door. So,
Okay.
but yeah, so
Wonderful.
hate to say retail plugs are difficult because they require so much attention.
Sure. Um, Also on that same note, I know you were joking about the higher authorities
Yeah, yeah.
for resources, but I just wondered, are there any other good resources, books or websites or whatnot that you kind of use or go to that we could share with our audience?
Absolutely. I mean, I love everything that Larry Weiner through Larry Weiner
Mhm.
Landscape Architects has done. They do a fantastic, it's a very in-depth seminar every the beginning of every January. It's called the New Directions in the American Landscape. Great organization, or great organization that puts on a fantastic conference. If you really want to dive in deep, it's a great one to connect in, and then also meet and network with a ton of professionals in the area. I actually have a mentor. A mentor of mine is Neil Diebold out in
Hmm.
at Prairie Nursery in Wisconsin. He started a native plant nursery back in the 80s when this was all just a bunch of, no one really knew what was going on. But his references on his website and all of his literature as far as meadow establishment and things like that go are fantastic. He's a pleasure to talk to. You normally get him on the phone as well. Um, certainly, I know Pennsylvania Master Watershed Stewards has done a lot of great work through Penn State Extension for specifically for our area. It's a fantastic program as well, that dives into watershed protection, riparian planting, wet meadow creation, stormwater management. That's another great resource that I think everyone can lean on, and they're great local folks that are really passionate about it. But yeah, there's a ton of them out there that are really fun. But off the top of my head, I say those three are really good starts for a dive into wet and dry meadow creation.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Wonderful. And maybe taking that one step further, there was a chat that came in about folks who might be designers or consultants specifically on meadows that you can recommend.
Yeah, absolutely. For meadow management and creation, there's land stewards. Um, the gentleman's name is Herman Moser. He's based out of Newtown Square. There's a good friend of mine, David Hughes, Weatherwood Design. He's another great meadow aficionado locally. And then you've got landscape design build firms like Indigenous Ingenuities in Doylestown, that do really nice work and have really created some beautiful meadows and managed beautiful meadows to fruition. And then over in New Jersey in Hunterdon County is Paul Steinbeiser Landscape Design. He's a gentleman I've known for over 25 years that I've been in the industry. And he's a little bit older than I. Really versed in meadow creation and management of, and he'd be a great one as a consultant. And then I would lean on also on the public gardens. There's some great talent in public gardens, and asking folks at certainly at Jenkins or I know Longwood has done some amazing things with their natural areas program. In any of the walks and talks that you can get on is would be really worthwhile. And certainly I'd be sad if I didn't mention Mount Cuba and their natural areas program as well. The 1,000 acres they have behind the more manicured gardens is absolutely fantastic, and everyone that works there is keen to and willing to talk talk shop. So yeah, getting yourself out there to these areas in the gardens and just looking interested. A lot of times the workers at these places will come up to you and ask you what you're doing. So yeah, that would be my best advice.
Awesome. Well, we
Mhm.
appreciate all that advice and all your time tonight. Any last questions from those of you still with us? Otherwise, we're gonna wrap it up for tonight. Well, John, again, thank you so much for spending the evening with us and educating us all about wet meadows. And I
Absolutely.
will work on getting the recording ready and resources. Lots of good information to share with everyone. So thanks
Fantastic.
again for being with us. Thanks
Very
again to
much.
everyone for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next month. All
Awesome.
right.
Thank you,
Bye,
guys.
everybody.
Bye-bye.